Dave's getting Facebook going, Bob.
Okay.
He'll be right. He'll be right here.
Good
Yeah, I
morning,
see you just
everybody.
got it on live on Facebook, so.
Okay, we're recording and we're live. Thank you, everybody, for being here on a beautiful Sabbath morning in Southern California. Maybe too beautiful. Maybe we should have more cloudy and rainy weather. Bob was telling me that it was quite warm up in Utah earlier this week, right?
Yes. Well, in fact, we've been warm and dry all winter. It's one of the driest winters we've had in about 20 years. Yeah.
Well, that's fun for when you're walking like you were when I was talking with you, but not so good for the water supply.
That's for sure. Yeah.
All right. We are going to get started now. I have asked Bronwyn to read the same portion of scripture that she read last week. That is Romans 8, verses 18 through 25, but this time to read it in a different version. Last time I had her read it in the New Revised Standard Version, which is the most linguistically reliable version there. If one wants to choose the version that's closest to the most recent Greek manuscripts, that's the one chooses. That is the most recently found Greek manuscripts, the New Revised Standard Version. But the New English Bible from 1970 is often easier to read and to understand. So I've asked her to read the same passage, this time from the New English Bible rather than the Revised Standard Version. As she does so, I'd like us to note three things again. One is that Paul's idea of salvation is very ecological. He's concerned about the whole natural order and its pain, groaning as though it were a woman giving childbirth. That's one thing. The second thing is that he talks about that first, and then he talks about our suffering as part of that. Whereas we are inclined to begin with our own suffering and then sort of magnify that out to the universe as a whole. But he begins with the ecological suffering, and then he moves to the individual human suffering, and then finally the emphasis upon hope. We often say we are saved by faith, but we are also saved by hope, in hope. So over to Bronwyn on Romans 8, 18 through 25.
And I think another thing to add is that this is so appropriate for this time that we're living in right now. It gave me a lot of hope and courage when I read it this morning. Romans 8, 18 through 25. For I reckon that the sufferings we now endure but bear no comparison with the splendor, as yet unrevealed, which is in store for us. For the created universe waits with eager anticipation for God's sons to be revealed. It was made the victim of frustration, not by its own choice, but because of him who made it so. Yet always there was hope. Because the universe itself is to be freed from the shackles of mortality and enter upon the liberty and splendor of the children of God. Up to the present, we know the whole created universe groans in all its parts, as if in the pangs of childbirth. Not only so, but even we, to whom the Spirit is given as first fruits of the harvest to come, are groaning inwardly while we wait for God to make us his sons and set our whole body free. For we have been saved, though only in hope. Now to see is no longer to hope. Why should a man endure and wait for what he already sees? But if we hope for something we do not yet see, then, in waiting for it, we show our endurance.
Okay, we are saved by hope or in hope, through hope, according to hope, something along those lines. Let's pray. Dear God, thank you for another Sabbath day. Thank you for this technology that brings us together from all parts of the world. Thank you for Bob Ford, who has blessed us twice already and will today again a third time. help us to lift our vision above and beyond our own issues, sorrows, and successes, important as they in some ways are, but to see them in a larger, more cosmic context of pain and suffering, for which we have hope of redemption. In Christ's name, amen. Okay, this time we're going to do things a little bit differently. Bob has chosen for us a rather long video, and we will show it in 15-minute segments. So the pattern will be, he will show about 15 minutes, about that length of time. Then we'll pause and have about that much time for discussion. And then we'll do another 15 minutes or so of the video, and then another 15 minutes. And so we'll alternate that pattern until we get through the whole of it, which means that when we come to our 15-minute time of discussion, it's really important that people jump in, because there won't be a lot of time for blank space as we wait for people to speak. Also, we are hoping that people will be as concise as possible. And finally, when the discussion first begins, we're going to ask you to indicate to Forrest, either by raising your hand or by speaking to him, that you would like to speak in that segment. And then he will determine who goes next, and we will have everybody go through a chance to speak once before we come back to have anybody speak a second time. So Bob, could you tell us a little bit about this video before you start to show us?
Excuse me, but David, before we start, can you give Monty and myself co-hosting here?
Yes. 1 second. That's a very good thing. Thank you. Well, Bob, you could go ahead, and I'll do this.
Okay. Today we're looking at a video by an atmospheric scientist who's also an evangelical Christian. She's married to an evangelical pastor, which is of interest. She's one of the leading scientists in the world dealing with climate change. When we start the video, this will be part of a webinar that was done, about 3 months ago. This was before the elections, and it's talking. The title of the webinar is "Climate Change: Our Faith Values and 2020," and it's led by another lady, a reverend, that's part of the Interfaith Power and Light community. There's also some introduction by a group called YECA, Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. And then there's a third group called the Catholic Climate Covenant. In the first 5 or 10 minutes, 5 minutes, we'll hear a little bit from some of these people and their organizations. And I think one of the questions we might want to discuss in that first segment is, are there opportunities in the Adventist community for that kind of interaction and concern as well? So are you ready then for us to start the video there?
Yes, so let's go right ahead. Thank you, Bob.
Okay. You tell me if it's going to be working. Do you see something there?
Yes.
Rashad. I'm president of Interfaith Power and Light, and our mission is to inspire and mobilize people of faith and conscience to take bold and just action on climate change. We were founded in the year 2000 as a religious response to global warming, and I want to welcome you to today's conversation with Dr. Catherine Hayhoe, Climate Change, Our Faith Values, and 2020. And I'll be joined today by my friend and colleague, Dr. Catherine Hayhoe. And our topic today is really about how to communicate with your family and friends about the climate crisis from a position of shared values. So first, we'll talk a bit with Dr. Hayhoe about her work and the perspective that she brings as a person of faith. Then we'll offer some resources for voter education to ensure that all of you attending feel prepared to educate your own communities about climate and this election. And finally, we'll have a Q&A session and an opportunity for you to ask questions of Dr. Hayhoe, and you probably have a lot. We'll try to get to as many of those as we can today. So if you have questions, please add them to the Q&A feature. If you're not familiar with where that is on Zoom, if you look on the lower right-hand corner of your screen, you'll see Q&A. So if you'll use that feature, we can keep track of the questions there, and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end of our discussion today. And before we begin, I want to thank our partners, Catholic Climate Covenant and Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, for being with us today. And so I want to introduce Jose Aguto of Catholic Climate Covenant to introduce himself and the Catholic Climate Covenant. So take it away, Jose.
Thank you, Susan. Blessed to be with you all here today and delighted to be in partnership with IPL and Young Evangelicals for Climate Action. We, the Covenant, are also engaged in what we would call moral discernment with regard to how Catholics may want to make their voter choices this election season. This particular webinar is the second of our 5-part series where we're helping Catholics discern through the lens of their faith and our fundamental values. We also have with the Covenant a voter pledge, which is centered around their discernment. And we invite anyone who's interested to take that pledge. And I'll just read it out just briefly, based on Pope Francis's Laudato Si: love for society and commitment to the common good are outstanding expressions of a charity which affects not only relationships between individuals, but also macro relationships, social, economic, and political ones. So during these challenging times, according to the pledge, we are called to bring our faith and our consistent moral framework to the important work in our communities, nation, and world, just as St. Francis of Assisi demonstrated throughout his life. We must put our love into action. So the specific pledge is: I pledge to vote with love and action in mind so as to protect life, respect human dignity, and promote the common good, including God's gift of creation. So feel free to go there, and also welcome any comments or questions you may have of me to help with your discernment. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Jose. Thanks so much for being here today. And I also want to introduce Kyle Myard-Skop of Young Evangelicals for Climate Action to talk about the work that they're doing this election season.
Thank you, Susan. Also delighted to be in partnership today with Interfaith Power and Light and with the Catholic Climate Covenant. Great to see my friend and YECA's senior advisor, Dr. Catherine Hayhoe. Always a delight to be able to hear from Catherine. Young Evangelicals for Climate Action is a national organization of young Christians across the country who are coming together and taking action to address the climate crisis as part of our Christian witness and discipleship. We often say we don't do this because we're left or right. We don't even do this because we're environmentalists. We do this because we're Christians. And this is just what it looks like to follow Jesus in a warming world. Since 2012, we have mobilized more than 20,000 young Christians across the country toward climate action. And this fall is no different. We also have our own voter engagement programs and campaigns up and running. I believe there may be another word about that later, at least a link to some of our efforts. So in the interest of time, and because you're here to hear Catherine and not me, I'll save that, but I will drop a link to our website in the chat box so that if you are interested in learning more about Young Evangelicals for Climate Action, you can head to that website. And like I said, there will be another link to some of our voter engagement campaign work later in the webinar.
Thank you, Kyle.
Can everyone hear me? I just want to stop there briefly before we introduce the main speaker. And I think, are any of you aware of whether in the Adventist Church, either among the youth or among others, are there any organizations similar to the ones you just heard about? We may want to discuss that later, but I thought it was interesting, and I would like to just kind of take the tone that they're trying to set. And they're suggesting that this is not a right or left or political, but it's about how Christian values might affect how we look at science, how we look at creation, and how our responsibilities. And so that's the main focus. And so let's now listen about the introduction to the key speaker, and we'll be stopping periodically, as Dave suggested, for questions and comment. I'll continue now.
Thanks to both of our partner organizations for being with us today. We really appreciate that. And with that, we are grateful to have Dr. Catherine Hayhoe join us for this timely discussion today. And so I want to introduce her to you. First of all, Dr. Catherine Hayhoe is an atmospheric scientist whose research focuses on understanding what climate change means for people and the places where we live. She is an endowed professor at Texas Tech University. She hosts the PBS digital series Global Weirding, and she has been named one of Time's 100 most influential people, the United Nations Champion of the Environment, and the World Evangelical Alliance's Climate Ambassador. And if you want to learn more about Catherine and see her resources on climate science and communicating about climate science, we're dropping a link for you into the chat so you can go to her website and find out more and watch some of her wonderful TED Talks. So Catherine, welcome and thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. It is great to be here with all of you.
Well, we have an impressive turnout today on this webinar. People are very excited to hear from you. And so I want to dive into our conversation today because I think, of course, we are in the midst of some really challenging times right now. We have seen an increase in 2020 in climate disasters from these just massive wildfires that are happening in the western U.S. to this derecho that went through Iowa to hurricanes in the Gulf and the Southeast. And I think that one question that may be on everyone's mind right now is, are we now able to directly attribute these weather events to climate change?
Well, often people say, was this event climate change or not? As if it was either 100% climate change or 0% climate change. And the answer is always in the middle because climate change is a threat multiplier. That term actually comes from the US military. And what that means is that most times climate change is not creating something that wouldn't otherwise exist. We have always had heat waves and hurricanes and wildfires and floods and other disasters as long as this planet's been here. But what climate change is doing is it's making them worse. And we can actually put numbers on that now. That's what climate scientists are doing these days. So for example, we know that without climate change, we would see over 10 million acres burned across the whole Western US since the 1980s, just naturally. But with a changing climate, we've seen almost 25 million acres burned as of 2015. And of course, those numbers are climbing every year. Wildfire after wildfire is breaking the record for the most area burned. And that's how climate change is affecting wildfires. Most wildfires in the lower 48 states are human ignition. But once those fires start, they have all of this dry tinder thanks to climate change that enables them to burn out of control, breaking record after record. With hurricanes, for example, with Hurricane Harvey, we know that about 40% of the rain that fell during Hurricane Harvey would not have happened if the exact same hurricane had occurred 100 years ago. We know that climate change has made heat waves much more likely. The European heat wave of last summer was 5 times more likely due to climate change. The Siberian heat wave from this summer was virtually impossible to happen without climate change. It was over 100 degrees. So yes, climate change is affecting our extremes, and we can put some numbers on those today.
That's really good to know that we can put some numbers with it now, because it feels maybe a little more tangible for people when we have some ability to, have the science sort of back up what our gut instincts are telling us right now.
Yes.
And I think, that our audience would be interested, Catherine, in learning how you came to be a climate scientist. What first interested you in the study of climate?
Absolutely. Before I do that, though, I'm actually going to drop a link in the chat. And the link is to one of our global weirding episodes that specifically explains how climate is changing and how it's affecting our extremes. Now, I heard a comment saying we're freezing. Are we freezing? I can see you just fine. Can you see me okay?
I can see you fine, yes.
Okay. So if your screen is freezing and you're listening, it's probably because of your internet. I think we all look fine here. But this is being recorded, and you will be able to watch it later, and the recording is not freezing, so we're all good.
Exactly.
Okay. So I was actually studying astrophysics. I was planning to be an astrophysicist, and I'd almost finished my undergraduate degree. I was already doing research looking at galaxy clustering around quasars, and I was planning my next move to graduate school, but I needed 1 extra credit to finish my degree. So I looked around, and there was a brand new class on climate science over in the geography department at my university, and I thought, why not take it? It looks interesting. So I am Canadian, so I grew up with the idea that the sky is blue and the grass is green and climate is changing due to human activities. But I had mentally lumped this issue together with what I considered environmental issues that environmentalists care about, that the rest of us wish them well. So I felt like there were certain people that cared about those things, and I wasn't one of those people. I wished them well, but that wasn't really what I did. So I took this class, and I was absolutely astonished to learn that climate change is, of course, an environmental issue, but it really is an everything issue. Climate change affects our health. It affects our food and our water. It affects our security. It affects the safety of our homes. It affects the economy. But most importantly, it disproportionately affects the poorest and most vulnerable people in the world. And for me as a Christian, that's where it really hit me, because I believe not only do we have responsibility for every living thing on this planet, which of course includes our fellow humans, but I particularly believe that we are to care for those less fortunate than us. And that's not a uniquely Christian belief. You see the same traditions in Judaism, in Buddhism, in Hinduism, and in Islam. The idea that those of us who have been blessed are to care for those who have not been. And with climate change, not only are we failing to care for the poor and the vulnerable, but we're actually making their lives worse. Because climate change is a threat multiplier. And although it multiplies our wildfires and our hurricanes here in North America, abroad, it multiplies things that devastate people's homes, their livelihoods, their food, that lead to refugee crises and famines, devastation and death. And so that for me was a huge inflection point in my career. I thought to myself, how can I not study this huge global problem? Because it absolutely is not fair.
I think
Let me stop there briefly. This is our first 15 minutes. I'm sorry, I got a tickle this morning. And this first segment, she covers a lot of the science issues, and so there may be some questions on that comes up. But I think some of the key questions, and what was interesting to me about her career is that I kind of went through the same kind of change. Some of you that know me from way back 40, 50 years ago, you may know that I taught in the School of Public Health. I got my master's first in anthropology and then public health, and I was working in the School of Public Health. And they wanted me to get training to come back as an epidemiologist. And I had a summer off, and very similar to what she did, I went to UCLA and took a course in medical geography. I had never taken geography before, which is a very kind of integrative, holistic type of discipline. And it got me started into looking at the interconnections between environment and food and drought. And I ended up getting a grant. I'm going to, you may remember from my presentation a couple of weeks ago, I got a grant from the US government through UC Riverside to go and study the drought in West Africa and the famous Sahelian drought. So what's kind of attracted me to, she's gone through a similar kind of career in philosophical and even Christian in revelation, shall we say, from looking at Christianity as primarily something that deals with us personally versus how Christianity affects how we look at the broader world, the macro relationships in the world. So this first part is really kind of showing her, shall we say, her coming to terms with her career and her beliefs and so on. Now, maybe we can go on, and let's go on now, unless there's a question at this point. I think from now on, it gets into more of the key substance that we want to discuss. Okay, let's listen some more.
I think that's just such a beautiful statement of how your faith is so connected to your work, which for some of us here in the US, that seems to be a bit of a struggle when we think about our faith and science and maybe ways that they actually are in opposition to one another. And I'm curious because of you mentioned that you're Canadian, and so your perspective coming into this is a little different than some of us here in the U.S. as well. But I'm just curious to know whether there have been times that studying climate change has challenged your faith in any ways.
So I grew up with a dad who's a science teacher. And I learned, first of all, that science is the coolest and most fascinating thing that you could possibly study. I was indoctrinated in that from a very early age. But I also learned from him that if we believe that God created this universe that we live in, then what is science other than trying to figure out how God did it? So there should not be a conflict between science and faith if we believe in a creator God. So why is there this conflict? It's one that's been deliberately and artificially manufactured over the years to shore up political positions and authority. And that begins with Galileo and the church. The church didn't want to say that the earth was not the center of the universe because that would somehow challenge the Pope's authority. It continues with issues of origins and evolution. The debate over evolution took root in the United States, and it was promoted by politicians. Specifically, the Secretary of State was the one who took part in the Scopes debate, because specifically they wanted to combat what they saw as ideology coming from Europe. And with climate change, the only reason there's any intersection between faith is not because of any theology that we have or might not have, but it's because climate change shows that we need solutions, and those solutions will alter the balance of power and wealth in this world, because the richest corporations in the world are the ones who are producing all of the fossil fuels that we're burning that's causing climate change. So this conflict between science and faith has always been actually between science and power. And so that's why the more I study this world and this universe, I don't see any conflict between my faith and my science. But what does discourage me is this. What discourages me is when I see people who claim to believe that we have responsibility to care for this planet, who claim to believe that we are to love others as we have been loved, and that the greatest commandment is to love our neighbor as ourselves, yet their behavior says exactly the opposite. That to me is the most discouraging thing, to be constantly hearing from people, as we all are in this world, who say one thing yet walk a completely different way.
So I'm curious, when you do hear those things, you speak to a lot of groups all over the country and around the world. And I'm curious to know how you respond to this misperception that people have about the conflict between faith and science. How do you use that as sort of a teachable moment for people in a way that, doesn't further entrench them in their position, let's say?
That's a good question. And I actually have a talk that I've given specifically on this, looking at the conflict model of science and faith, and then looking at the independent magisteria concept where, you do yours and they do theirs, and never the twain shall meet. And then the complementarian version of science and faith, which is the one that I specifically agree with, which is that they complement each other. In other words, for example, in the area of climate science can tell us that climate is changing, that humans are responsible, that the impacts are serious, and we need to do something. But what are we supposed to do? Science can tell us what we're supposed to do. That's where our values come in. And our values don't necessarily come from our faith. People who are humanists and atheists have plenty of values related to fairness and justice and equality and taking care of people who are less fortunate than us and caring for our common home, as the Pope calls it. But for those of us who do belong to a faith tradition, that's where our values come from. And our values are not something to be shunted to the side. They are front and center when we're making decisions. So when I talk to people about this, what I do is I start with what we believe. And I speak specifically often to people who share my beliefs. I encourage other people who have different beliefs to speak to people who share their beliefs too, because we're most effective messengers if we speak to the people that we have most in common with. But I start with what we actually believe. So, speaking from the Bible in Genesis 1, how it talks about how we have responsibility over every living thing on this planet, how we are to, the Hebrew words are abad and shamar, how we are to care for, protect, keep this planet. And then going on to talk about how we are to care for others who are less fortunate than us. There is no conflict when you actually go to what the Bible says. It's when we listen to politicians, pundits, and so-called religious leaders whose statement of faith is written first by their politics and only a very distant second by the Bible. That's where the conflict arises.
I wonder if you could.
I'm not hearing you, Bob.
Yes, I mean, unmute myself. Dave, Forrest, I think this is a good point to take some questions. Forrest, are there some comments or questions?
Yeah,
I think, please go ahead, Forrest.
yeah, I was going to say, if someone has a question, raise your hand electronically, and I'll recognize you.
Okay, while people are raising their hands, maybe I can comment and Forrest can get people in line. So either, I think, raise your hand electronically or maybe wave it in the screen somehow. Let Forrest know. Now, right here, Professor Hayhoe touched on something that's really important, and that is the relationship between religion and science. And she distinguished three different positions. One is that they are in conflict. The second is that they are what some people call non-overlapping magisteria. That is, here's science and here's religion, and they are two separate worlds, and they don't affect each other at all. So what one believes scientifically has nothing to do with what one believes theologically. That's just another way. And then she talked about the complementary way. Now, what I would like to add to that is that this complementary way has itself three different options. And they concern what one should do if there is a genuine conflict between faith and science. Now, she puts it as though there really cannot be, but what if theoretically speaking, we say there is? Then one has three options. If science and theology are saying different things, one option would be to say, okay, theology has the trump card. We will listen to science as far as theology lets it go, but in the end, and in the final analysis, theology has the final say. That's one way of having a complementary approach. A second is just the opposite. That would be to say, okay, let's have science be the one that has the trump card here. So if they're in conflict with each other, we have theology defer to science. But the third way is to have them interactive and to say one never has automatic priority over the other, and that when we have a conflict, we must examine both sides, because it's maybe that science will require us to understand theology differently, but on the other hand, theology may require us to understand science differently. So there's no priority necessarily given one to the other. It's back and forth, back and forth. Now, I think that third one is the most adequate. However, it's also the least comforting to many people, because it doesn't leave you with a final source of truth. One always has to be working back and forth with one's various and plural sources of truth. And yet I think that's right. I do think that the Bible, at least our understanding of the Bible needs to be corrected by our understanding of science, but also I think that our understanding of science sometimes needs to be corrected by our understanding of the Bible. For instance, a lot of science is very deterministic. And I think those of us who have a biblical background need to be cautious about accepting that determinism. And I think that we should challenge it at certain points. Also, lots of science is egoistic in that it senses that most living creatures are concerned about themselves or only their small communities, their kin. But Christians think, Jews, Muslims, Christians think that it's possible to have genuine regard, which is not disguised self-regard, but genuine regard for people who are not members of our family or not immediately close to us in our community. So those are two places where I think the interaction can go back and forth. Okay, that's enough for me. Maybe somebody has a question or comment.
I don't have any hands, but I do have a question, if I may ask it at this point.
Good.
What in the Adventist tradition, what about the impact of the imminent parousia? Do you think that has an impact upon the reason that more Adventists don't get involved in climate issues? Or if so, how does one address that, in your opinion?
I'll let Bob respond to that.
You used a big word there. Can you maybe define what you mean? I assume you're talking about the second coming and the destruction of the earth and so on.
Yeah, and soon, not
right,
not
yeah.
indefinitely in the future.
Right, yeah, and of course that's been a long Adventist discussion. Every generation has assumed that the end would come in 5 years or sooner, and they lived their life and their theology was that way. I remember 2 weeks ago we were discussing, how I think I mentioned my grandfather was absolutely convinced that the Ottoman Empire, when it fell, or when it fell, and when Israel was established, that was going to be the end of the world. And now that whole perspective about the end of the world and what does it mean for the second coming. And now, if any of you have listened to some of the presentations that Dave put online from the Lausanne group and the Exeter group, they talk about the whole concept in the Bible of redemption and restoration. And so the idea, and of course Adventists have taken that idea to suggest that the end of the world is really about cleansing this world, taking us to heaven, and then bringing us back to a restored earth in which all of the terrible things have been cleaned up. Okay, and of course, many Christians say the quicker the better. Okay, let's have it, bring it on, bring on the end of the world. Now, I'm not a theologian, so I'm going to defer to David here to talk about maybe are there some flaws, I assume, in that perspective, because one could also, I think all of us know well the story of the 10 virgins. The central story was that there is something that we need to do while we're waiting for that second coming. And part of that waiting is to be responsible and careful and to plan. So that seems to go counter to this other view. So I don't know, Forrest, David, how do you think about that?
Well, I agree with you. Now, here's where we can harken back to Roy Branson, I think, for a distinction that he made, which is very important. And that's the difference between Millerite and Adventist expectations about the second coming. And those have a chronological significance. That is, the Millerites came before the Adventists. But he's talking about it more in terms of mindsets. The Millerite consciousness is the one that's expecting with a whole bunch of confidence that the end of the world and the beginning of the new world is at the present time, just around the corner. And therefore, such people really aren't interested in building institutions. They really aren't concerned about the environment and so forth. And we do have lots of Adventists who have that kind of Millerite consciousness, and therefore they are very suspicious of the work we have done in building institutions and the like. Adventist consciousness, Roy would have suggested, is that the view that we ought to be expectant, but we have no idea for sure how long it will be. Therefore, we ought to live as though it were going to happen tomorrow, but plan as though it would not happen for 10,000 years. And that combination is what has carried the day in most areas. And that's why we have places like Loma Linda. If we had a strictly Millerite consciousness, we wouldn't be building that big building on campus that we're now building. We would think that, well, the end of the world is just around the corner and we probably won't be able to fill it with patients before the end of the world comes. But since we have an Adventist consciousness, which says we anticipate the second coming, we anticipate it being soon, but we don't know what soon means. And 2 Peter says, 1 day is 1,000 years to God and 1,000 years as to 1 day. So what does soon mean? We don't know. So we continue our work. Now, I would think that what we need now is an expanded definition of health. We have focused a lot on personal health, and I think we have come to see that one cannot be a healthy person in an unhealthy community. And so we have a school of public health, but I think we also need to expand that to say, well, one cannot be a healthy person apart from a healthy community, and one cannot have a healthy community unless one has a healthy environment or ecology. So it's a matter of expanding our horizons of concern, I think, rather than flat out contradicting them. In any case, I think Roy's distinction between Millerite consciousness and Adventist consciousness, both of which are alive and well today in the Adventist community, really makes a difference here.
David, could that be, we've prided ourselves as a church of being progressive in our theology and our growth and understanding. I know that progressive in these days has kind of a different connotation in politics, but in theology, could that be something that would help us to understand?
I think so. And here progress is such that it doesn't contradict anything that we previously held. That is, if we are beginning with a concern for personal health and we progress to the point where we have concern for the community's health and then progress to the point where we have concern for the environment's health, we haven't left anything behind. We've gradually added to our understanding and scope of concern. By the way, I think that's the best way to think of the Christian life. Not that one subsequently learns things that contradict earlier things, but one gradually grows and expands one's knowledge base, expands one's concern. And I would think, Bob, that this is sort of what happened in your own experience, that what you learned was at tension at some points with what you had previously believed. But on the other hand, it was possible for you to add what you had learned to what you previously believed and benefit from both.
In the middle of the screen.
I don't know if you want to respond to that, Bob, or
No,
not.
absolutely. I would say that's very much the case. And I do even today get questions, I think I mentioned before, on Facebook and otherwise. They say, well, why didn't you become a minister and a missionary like your grandparents or your parents? Why did you become a scientist? And and I, I don't know if I told this story, but my grandfather way back in 1928, 29, when he was a missionary in South America, traveled through the Amazon. And he was a missionary, he was a pastor, but he loved nature, and he would have probably become a naturalist if he hadn't become a missionary, and he never saw it as contradictory. And so in a sense, I'm kind of picking up, I'm becoming the naturalist and geographer that he wasn't.
Okay, David, we have a question from Simona.
Okay.
Simona, go ahead.
It's more of a comment than a question. There is also a group of Christians, and unfortunately a pretty big one, and some of them are in our church as well, who believe that by not caring about the environment, by helping hasten the destruction of the planet, will hasten second coming. And I have encountered that, to my dismay, way too many times. And the first thing when I first heard that, probably some 10, 15 years ago, the first thought that went through my mind was, what arrogance. What arrogance that people like that believe that they can manipulate God's timeline. God's timeline by, doing what they think is going to make things happen.
Simona, I think you make a very good point. Do any others have a feeling? And maybe at this point it might be useful to continue on, David, unless there's an urgent question, to listen to what Dr. Hayhoe. She kind of addresses this issue, I think, about what do we do? How do we react? How do we implement our Christian values in the world that we live in? And would this be a good point to go on, or is there a comment first?
I'd like to comment in two ways to Simone's observation. One is to say she was closer to being accurate last week than I was. That is, she saw what happened there in the Capitol as a more structured and more severe than I did. And as we have learned over the past several days about more and more about what happens there, I think her reading of the situation was more accurate than mine. Secondly, I think her comment suggests something that we should always keep in mind, and that is Adventism is irreducibly pluralistic. There will always be a range of views on any topic that we have. Now, that range of views is within certain contours, but I'm not prepared to say that what Simone is talking about is false. She has heard this, but I will say I never heard that in my whole lifetime. And it may be that others have never heard that in their whole lifetime. So what does that mean? Not that she's wrong and I'm right. What it means is that we grew up encountering different kinds of Adventists, and that will always be the same. Now we have to ask which is normative. And I would think that most people in the Adventist church would not say that what these people said to her, but there will always be people who put things somewhat differently.
Okay.
Looks like Juan wants to talk.
I wonder, are you folks going on, or may I make a comment?
Well, why don't you raise your hand? I've got somebody ahead of you, McKinley.
Go right ahead, please.
Okay. Juan.
Okay. Thank you for this very interesting and stimulating conversation. I mean, it's something that I've been thinking for some time, and I'm happy that this issue of the climate change and religion beliefs is presented. Too bad that I missed last week for personal reasons. I think the Adventist Church is a denomination that, at least in my humble opinion, has either by design or by default done a lot, and conceptually, and also for the following of the members, I mean, that is in consonance with what is needed to be done as far as an actions to prevent or mitigate climate change. I think there are, in my opinion, two very important things. The issue of promoting a healthy diet, that happens to be that the healthy diet that the Adventist Church promotes, I mean, is a mitigation aspect for climate change. And also the well concept of the Sabbath. The Sabbath as a day of rest, of disconnect, of stopping economic activity. And that is not only on the concept of a single day, but also on the concept of rest. And as you know now that, I mean, we have been forced to rest with the pandemic, the economic rest, I mean, the issues of climate change improve a little bit, or at least, I mean, okay, I think you know what I try to mean. So on the other side, I mean, given the belief on the second coming, yes, I have encountered some people that share this opinion of Simon, since anything that we do, I mean, if is hasten the second coming. So we are a kind of a schizophrenic situation, or a situation that is quite unique and special. On one side, I think we have done and we're doing de facto and voluntarily, probably in favor of the mitigation of the climate change. But on the other side, we have some of us, or some of them, whatever in the Adventist denomination, that really have this other mentality, and here we are. Anyway, that's my viewpoint.
Okay, you want to respond to that, Bob?
No, I think that's okay. We'll talk more about this as well. I don't know. Did
Yeah,
McKinley want to say? McKinley want to say something, or?
I just would like to come. I think Professor Sabate is touching on something really important, and that is even resources like the Sabbath. We notice that the Sabbath commandment protects the animals and not just the human beings, and therefore we ought to have regard to their welfare as well. So the Sabbath is a blessing to us, but it's also a blessing to the donkey and the ox and the sheep and so forth and so on. Again, though, he's emphasizing how basically pluralistic, and I'm going to keep hammering away on that, because we all tend to think that the kind of Adventism we know best is the kind of Adventism that exists everywhere. And that simply isn't the case. That we need to recognize that Adventists around the world, there are 20 million of us, and we are not all of the same mind or of the same feelings on any of these issues. Okay, I think, who's next, Forrest?
Yeah, I have two. I got McKinley and Roger. Did you want to go to the film some more before we have more questions, or you want to take these now?
If I get a vote on this, I would prefer to take people's questions and comments as they occur.
Okay.
And if we don't get through the whole video, we'll continue it next time.
Okay. All right, McKinley, go. And then Roger, I've got you on deck.
Thank you very much. Happy Sabbath to you all. My apologies for missing the start, Dr. Ford. But I want to comment on the discussion about the difference or the apparent or perceived difference or conflict between science and faith. My own thinking is that I don't see any conflict between science and faith or theology in this respect. Both are fields of knowledge. Science is from the Latin scientia, S-C-I-E-N-T-I-A, and also has a root, I think, scire, S-C-I-R-E, which means to know. And so I like to think of science and theology or faith as being on a knowledge continuum, much as we have the electromagnetic spectrum. Theology and quote unquote science, and I've substituted the word research in some of my conversations to sort of clarify this distinction between knowing and discovery. But I think if one were to look at those two topics that way, one might arrive at the thinking that there really is not this distinction that people insist on. And I think the distinction is rather contrived. Another point I'd like to share is that science, quote unquote, has a lot of uncertainty. And that is why, although, particularly when it is looked at in terms of origins and cosmology, we find a lot of revision in the thinking about some of the positions of scientists. For example, in the estimation of the age of the universe, most people think it's around 13.8 billion years, but that range is between 6 to 26 billion years. And so it's good to think about research and discovery as knowledge, and theology as another form of knowledge. And I think the case can be made, particularly when one thinks about the Bible, that there are concepts and topics in the scriptures that align very much with what some people might call science. Dr. Ford, do you have a thought about my thinking?
No, I agree. I think that goes along with what David was talking about in terms of those that believe that they're totally incompatible, science and religion, versus complementary, versus being, magisterial, totally separate fields. And if I understand you, I think you're saying that it's really complementary. And I think an important point that you're raising is the uncertainty principle. I mean, that's a very biblical idea. We don't know neither the time of the end of the world, and our responsibility is not to speculate on when the end of the world is going to be, but to be good stewards, and that's another word we haven't talked about yet. Be good stewards while we're waiting for the end to come. And to me, that means that you have to include both. Does that make sense to you, McKinley?
Yes, it does. And I think while some folks might want to look at those three separations that you talked about, I think many Christians tend to want to defer to quote unquote scientific fact when there is a conflict between, apparent conflict between what they consider to be science and what the Bible might have to say about that. But I think the way that you framed it is also consistent with my thinking. Thank you.
And I think maybe this would be a good point to go on, because I think Dr. Aho raises some of these issues about how do we deal with fact and learning and changing knowledge as it relates to our faith values. So let me, at this point, I'm going to continue playing the video.
Could share with our audience today maybe a specific example of a time when you entered into conversation with someone, maybe at an event or something like that, who was genuinely open but questioning about how to bridge the divide between how they are thinking about climate change and their faith.
Sure. Well, I have conversations with people all the time. And what's really important to recognize is that we aren't just black or white, yes or no, believer or denier on this issue. We fall across a spectrum. And the 6 Americas of global warming really explains what the spectrum looks like. So at one end, we have people on climate change who are alarmed. And then we have people who are concerned and cautious. And then we have people who are doubtful or disengaged. And then finally, we have people who are dismissive. So just a second here, because I'm looking a bit fuzzy. That's a little bit better. So people who are dismissive are the people who talk about this all the time. And if somebody is really obsessed with rejecting climate change and they just can't stop talking about it, we're not going to be able to change their mind because they're not even going to listen to anything that we say. But what we can do is we can talk to people who have genuine questions. And how we can tell that they do is if they're willing to engage in a two-way dialogue. So if you feel like somebody's listening to you and it's a two-way street, so you have to listen to them first, that's when we can have those positive conversations. So I've had many of these conversations, and let me just give you one example. So a couple of years ago, we had some visitors at our church. My husband's the pastor of the church. They wanted to go out for lunch afterwards, so we all went out for lunch. And over the course of lunch, it came up that the pastor's wife was a climate scientist. You could tell they were very surprised. So the man leaned across the table and he said, "Do you believe in climate change?" And I said, "No, I don't." And he said, "But aren't you a climate scientist?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Well, why don't you believe in it?" And I said, "Because it's not a religion. I believe in God. I don't believe in climate change. I believe that God gave us a brain and a sound mind to actually look at his creation and figure out what's happening. And so I know that climate is changing. I know that humans are responsible because we've checked every other reason that could be. And I know that the impacts are serious, and I care about it because of my faith. Because we are to care for every living thing, including our sisters and brothers on this planet. And so because I immediately reframe the discussion as it's not a competition between the false religion of climate change and the true religion of whatever somebody believes, rather it's a case of whoever we are, we already care about climate change. We just didn't realize it. So that conversation went in a completely different direction because he was expecting me to be the false prophet of the green religion, whereas in fact, climate change is not a religion. It is just a fact that no matter who we are, no matter what we believe, no matter where we live, it matters to every single one of us.
That's so great. And I think about how, meeting people where they are is so important in this work. And even the work that we do at Interfaith Power and Light, where we are working with faith leaders all over the country, people who are in leadership in their congregations in various roles. And we know that congregations have been doing important work on issues that intersect with climate change for such a long time, whether that's hunger or, immigration and refugee resettlement to disaster relief, so many intersected issues. And sometimes it's maybe a little bit about helping them to connect the dots between the thing that they already care about and the issue of climate change, and then seeing what they can actually do to address the problem. And I love that you're centering this on the conversation about values. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about how you think this values-based conversation can really move people maybe a little bit out of the head conversation and a little more into the heart conversation.
Yes, I think that is absolutely the key, because every conversation we have on climate change these days seems to be from the head, arguing over facts and information and data, when we know we live in a post-truth society where my opinion is better than your facts if my opinion agrees with that of my group or my tribe. So we've seen this as recently as, just today on Twitter, where all kinds of people have this map of wildfires. And all the wildfires are in the United States, but there's no wildfires on this map in Canada. So everybody's like, oh, isn't it a coincidence that all of these so-called climate impacts stop at the border? And of course, the reality is that it's a US map, so it doesn't show Canadian data. And if you go to Canada, it's got all the Canadian data plus some US data too. So arguing over these facts, though, doesn't change anybody's mind. The only reason why I combat disinformation on Twitter, for example, is for the people who actually are not sure about it, not the people who are posting it. How do we build a bridge, though, between this contentious divide that's getting bigger and bigger? Climate change, for a number of years, has been the most politicized issue in the entire United States. for years. And it's rapidly moving in that direction in Canada, Australia, the UK, and beyond. I was talking with a colleague from France this morning, and he was telling me about climate denial in the Christian church in France as well. Even as of just a few weeks ago, climate change is still the most politically polarized issue, although coronavirus is now number 2 and racism is number 3. So how do we have a conversation about climate change if it's even more contentious than racism and coronavirus? It begins with the heart, not the head. It begins by connecting over genuinely shared values. And if we don't know what those are, we need to have a conversation to figure out if we have any. And then once we figure out what some shared values might be, and they can sometimes be as simple as knitting or cooking or the place where we live or our kids, a shared faith, obviously, or both being members of the Rotary Club or having previous military experience or enjoying birding or hiking or the same types of hobbies. Once we can figure out what we have in common, step number 1. Step number 2 is connect the dots between climate change and what we already care about. So instead of trying to instill new values into people, which is frankly impossible at any age past, that of a young child, instead of trying to instill new values, which also carries with the overtone of judgment. If I'm trying to instill new values into you, that means I find your values to be subpar, which never comes across well. Instead, respect and acknowledge someone's values, connect the dots to climate change to show how they're the perfect person to care about climate change, exactly who they are. In fact, caring about climate change makes them a more genuine expression of who they already are. And then, step number 3, offer positive, constructive solutions that are consistent and compatible with their values and their ideology. Because the 2 biggest problems we have are this: not the science. I know all the arguments start with the science, but that's not the biggest problem. The 2 biggest problems we have are, number 1, we don't think it matters to us. And number 2, we don't think there's anything we can do to fix it. So bond over shared values, connect the dots to how climate change affects them, and then talk about a positive, constructive conversation that we can engage in. And that is how we can build that bridge. And if you want more, I'm going to drop a link to my TED Talk in right here. Or Tiffany, if you have that, you might go ahead and do it yourself, because I go through a little bit more, how do we do this? And I give some examples.
Okay, let me stop there. I think she made some very, very important points, and I'd like to hear from the group. It's how do we get away from the debates that are never ending and never resolved, and get and focus more on the heart instead of the head, and to focus on what we have, or what our common values are, and then how can we bring about positive change. What's your reactions to that? Maybe we're all in agreement. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I was muted and now I'm unmuted. But Roger had a question that he would like to ask.
Go ahead.
Hey, really, Forrest, I don't have a question now. I was just trying to figure out how to raise my hand in case I had one. So
Okay, then I'll then go to Bronwyn. You have your hand raised.
Yes, I just want to say I love her story about how she handled that question at lunch. I thought that was so insightful. I learned so much from that.
How many? I've had similar types of encounters, and I think this underlines something we were talking about earlier. Forrest, you raised the question. And part of it is maybe a misunderstanding of what science is. Science is a mechanism for learning the truth, exploring. We never get 100% of it. It's constantly changing, it's growing, it's learning, we're adapting. And maybe that uncertainty is the problem. Maybe it's, I don't know, I'm going to step out of bounds here a little bit, David. Do churches, and particularly do Adventism, do we attract people that want certainty? At least some of them, they want certainty. And then if you find something that forces you to believe, to change your belief or to grow, then that becomes very uncomfortable. Is that the problem?
Was that, you referring that to me?
Yeah, yes, David. Yeah.
Well, I think for sure, religion in general is a way to keep one's life together when otherwise it might seem falling as though it's falling apart. I just think that when we become involved in the life of the church, whether we're very young or we're coming into it from some other community of faith or no community of faith, we ought to understand that we're starting a journey. We should know that from the very beginning. We're starting a journey, and there's no possibility that one will believe exactly the same thing 10 years from now as we believe now. We won't lose touch with our basics, but things will change. When I had baptismal classes for youngsters, I said that. You know, you're 12 years old now, and that's great, but when you're 22, your understanding of what it means to be a Christian will be different. And when you're 42, it will be different still. So we can socialize people into the idea that change is to be expected. But I think you're right. People will retreat to a religion when they feel overly stressed by too much change in the world around them.
Okay, I have Simona, you have your hand up, and back to you.
No, so when she was talking about this, I remembered a friend of mine. She works for the Gates Foundation in Africa, and their job is to vaccinate people. And as you know, there is lots of disinformation related to vaccination all over the world, including in our country. And so I asked her, how do they deal with that? With that, fear and, you know, disbelief or even hostility towards vaccination, which is such a great tool that we have. And she said, facts don't change people's minds, stories do. And I really very often think about what she said, because if somebody doesn't want to see a fact, you cannot change their mind. Some people really don't live in a fact-based reality anymore. And they often use their faith as a reason for that, which is, I think, a misuse of faith. But to reach them, sometimes telling a story that touches on their own experience may be more powerful than giving them the facts.
That's very powerful. Thank you, Simona. That's very good.
Bob, do you think we should take a break?
Yes, this might be a good time to take our break. Yeah, and then we can come back and continue to listen. Yeah.
Okay, because it looks to me like we're about halfway through the video. And let's see, according to my time, it's 11:43. What if we got together again in 12 minutes, 11:55? Would that work?
Sounds great. Yeah.
Okay, see you all in 12 minutes. Thank you.
So Forrest, I see you're getting well hydrated there.
Yeah, it's my health beverage.
Good, good. Okay.
By the way, I was introduced to this Hayhoe, Dr. Hayhoe several years ago. She's a very intriguing individual.
She really is, yes.
Yeah, and her life has been threatened by evangelicals because of her stands on climate change.
Yeah, that's really sad. And she has some wonderful TED Talks. And then there's, they mentioned earlier that PBS series that she runs about global weirding. It sure has a very, very interesting teaching approach, very open-minded. And I think is, you know, we need more people like her. I've had one or two teachers in my life when I was in college and graduate school that were also charismatic, but also good teachers, you know, and she reminds me of people like that. It's wonderful. Well, David, I see you're back on.
Let's turn on the video. Let's go.
Okay, okay.
Thank
So,
you.
yeah, I think we'll continue now with the video, and then we'll stop again for more questions.
That's really helpful, Catherine. And of course, you know, this 2020 is a big year in the country, right? Not only because of all the strange things that are happening and all of the climate wildfires and global weirding, as you say, that's happening this year, but also because it's a major election year. And I wonder if you can say why you think 2020 is so important for climate action, considering that it is an election year, and also being mindful that we're a C3 organization.
Yes. Absolutely. And for anybody who missed my answer to the previous question, I posted my TED Talk here. You can click on the TED Talk and it goes through that bond, connect, and inspire with positive solutions framework. So people often ask me, is it too late? And the answer to that is yes and no. So just like with climate impacts, people always want to know, is it all climate change or nothing climate change? And with is it too late, they want to know, is it, you know, not too late at all or 100% too late? And the answer is in the middle. It's as if we've been smoking for years and even decades. So there is some lung damage. Some impacts of climate change are already here today. Some are inevitable because of our past choices. But we don't have emphysema, we don't have lung cancer, and we're not dead. So when is the time to stop? The time is now, as soon as possible. And I know, because this is what I study, I know that the faster we reduce our carbon emissions, the better off we'll be. There isn't any magic number. 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees don't mean that if we end up at 1.499 or 1.999 instead of 1.5 or 2, it doesn't mean that everything's okay. Those are just goals that we have set because we need goals. If you're going to lose weight, what's the first thing you do? You step on the scales and then you set a goal, right? But the goal isn't a magical, it just means that it's something to head towards. What we do know from the science is that the more we cut our carbon emissions, the less change there will be and the better off we will all be. 2.5 degrees is better than 3. 2 degrees is better than 2.5. 1.5 is better than 2. But no matter what we do, our actions and our choices really do make a difference. And as soon as possible is that time. So today, unfortunately, we have people in power, and this is not just a US issue, this is happening around the world, people in power who are saying that a thermometer isn't telling us that it's getting warmer, who are saying that we don't know it's humans when in fact we've known since the 1850s. That digging up coal at that time, and then later oil and gas, is wrapping an extra blanket around the planet, causing it to run a fever. A thermometer is not liberal or conservative. What we need is we need political parties of all stripes to say, okay, the science is real, but we can disagree over solutions. Because there's liberal solutions and there's conservative solutions and there's bipartisan solutions. And the science can't say this is the best solution. The science just says we need to cut carbon. So we need politicians across the entire political spectrum to have solutions. And that's why I'm so encouraged by conservative organizations and conservative people that are proposing tangible solutions to climate change. We need to hear from everybody because this problem affects every single one of us, no matter where we live, no matter what language we speak, no matter what country we're in, and no matter how we vote.
Thank you, Catherine. And it's really wonderful to think about how, hope sort of requires that we have a sense of agency. And I think that's really what you're saying is we do still have a sense of agency and that our choices matter. And I'm gonna pause at this point because I want to invite Kyle back into this conversation so that he can ask a question from Young Evangelicals for Climate Action.
Sure.
Thanks, Susan. Catherine, you've always been a great champion of YDCA and of the leadership of young people across the board, especially young Christians on this issue. I wonder if you could say a little bit about what you think the unique value add or the unique role that young people of faith bring to the climate action space, and why is it so important for young people of faith to be engaged?
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad you asked that. And let me just say that if you're not familiar with Kyle's organization, it is such a source of inspiration and encouragement. Tens of thousands. What are your numbers at now, Kyle?
Over 20,000.
Over 20,000 young evangelicals across the United States alone advocating for climate policy and clean energy policy at every level, from their city to their state to the national level. Young people's voices are really important because the most important thing we can do, and this is the topic of my TED Talk, the most important thing any of us can do is talk about this. So often we're told to change a light bulb or drive an electric car, get solar panels, eat less meat, fly less or not at all. And yes, all of those things absolutely do reduce our personal carbon footprint. Do not get me wrong. But 2/3 of the heat trapping gas emissions since the dawn of the industrial era have been produced by 90 corporations. And on the list of the richest companies in the world are many of those companies. So the reality is we need system-wide change. And to get that change, we need to talk about climate change. We need to use our voice to advocate for change. And we need to vote. And kids have shown us that in spades. Let me just give you one example. So a few years ago, there was a young girl, early teens, who was very worried, very anxious, and very depressed about climate change. She reduced her carbon footprint. She persuaded her family to do it too. They did everything they could to live a low carbon lifestyle. And if that was the only thing they had done, nobody would know her name. But she did one more thing. She took a piece of white cardboard. She painted a few simple words on that cardboard, "School Strike for Climate." She went and she sat outside a building, and now she is the poster child for young people advocating for climate action around the world, because of course her name is Greta. Why do we know her name? It's because she used her voice. Every young person has a voice to use, and they are so creative, they are so dedicated, they are so persistent, and they are so passionate in using those voices that I think that they not only encourage us all, they challenge us all as well.
That's fabulous. Thank you. And we're gonna move on in a moment to some questions from our attendees. It looks like we have a lot of questions, so we'll get to a few of them. But first, I want to just share a few ways that you can help. And the first, in whatever way is appropriate for your faith tradition, you can pray. Pray that we will hear the cry of the earth and the cries of our neighbors to act on climate. And yet we also pray with our actions. So as Catherine says, we encourage you to have courageous conversations with your family and friends. Educate yourself and others. You can see that Catherine has a number of TED Talks. They're fabulous. I encourage you to go in and watch those, and others of many scientists who are using their voices and sharing information with us. And we also want to encourage you to get involved with our Faith Climate Justice Voter campaign. So we have a website with lots of materials. We're dropping that link into the chat for you. And of course, if Catholic Climate Covenant or Young Evangelicals for Climate Action brought you here, we're dropping the links to their voter campaign efforts into the chat as well. So we encourage you to check out their resources also. Additionally, IPL and Faith and Public Life have a faith voter reflection guide for 2020. And this is a guide that can help you understand how faith voters align their values with their vote. And the guide is available digitally and also in a print version. So that is also in the chat for you. And then if you're a faith leader, if you preach and teach regularly in your congregation, we encourage you to use your prophetic voice to encourage your congregation to vote. So we have some resources for you and some sermon resources that can assist you. And those are also going into the chat. And then finally, we really want you to pledge to vote your values this year. So you can take the Faith Climate Justice Voter Pledge and also share that pledge with your community. So we encourage you to do that. Finally, please make sure your voter registration is current and make a plan to vote. With the pandemic and other voter suppression tactics, elections this year might be challenging in places. So make a plan to vote early. Our partner, When We All Vote, offers Voter Resources Hub, where you can check your voter registration, request your mail-in ballot, research your ballot, find your polling location, register to vote, and more. And so we're dropping the When We All Vote's Voter Resources Hub into the chat for you as well. And so at this time, I'm going to ask Tiffany if she wants to start us off with a question from someone in our audience today.
Yes, there are 77 questions in the Q&A and a lot in the chat. So we're obviously not going to get to all of them, but maybe I've tried to sort of put them into categories. I think maybe an easy one to start off with is there was several folks asking about, Catherine, your comment around the number of acres of wilderness burning now versus if we didn't have climate change, and questions about a resource for that people can cite. And you're on mute.
I've been dropping things into the chat as we've been going along because I've been seeing questions about what do we say to people who are pro-life? How do we address the issue of overpopulation? How do you know which companies are responsible for most of the global greenhouse gas emissions? I've been dropping those resources into the chat. So I will go ahead and drop one more resource into the chat, which is to the National Climate Assessment. Now, if you're not familiar with the National Climate Assessment, it is massive. I am one of the hundreds of authors that wrote the nearly 2,000 pages, but don't worry, it's not a mystery novel. You don't have to start at the beginning and go to the end. It's very well organized, and it has a section for each part of the United States. And we have a global weirding episode also, a video for each section of the United States. And then it has a section for each sector, including indigenous peoples, including coastal areas, and including rural areas, which are often really left behind when we're talking about climate impacts. And in the Southwest chapter, that's where you find the statistics on area burned by wildfire that I quoted. So I put that in the chat, and I encourage everybody to check out the National Climate Assessment because it's a great resource. And they also have chapter summaries in Spanish too, which are fantastic to share.
Thank you. That's great. And we'll be, along with recording this this discussion, we'll send that out to everybody who's registered, along with all the links in the chat in an email tomorrow morning. Mm-hmm. So we'll get that link to you if you don't catch it in the chat. Lots of other questions. Some question maybe about category about sort of the climate impacts right now. So somebody referenced the NPR story yesterday talking about people in the Northwest asking about where do we go now in these times. And so the question is, how soon do you think other states will be asking this question?
People have been asking me that question already for over a decade. Because what we see again is climate change is a threat multiplier. So it is usually not creating issues we haven't had before. The West has had wildfires and air quality issues. The Gulf Coast has had hurricanes. The Midwest has had floods and droughts. But it's making them worse, a lot worse, to the point where it affects the safety of our homes and our families. It affects the local economy. It affects the quality of the air that we breathe and the water we drink and our health. And so people are starting to ask, where should we go? Now, they've looked at it, and so far we're not actually seeing climate migration happening in large amounts. But we are starting to see climate refugees, and it's happening right here in the US. Native Americans are on the front lines of this. From tribes in Louisiana whose land is sinking into the Gulf of Mexico, to tribes up in Alaska whose land is literally crumbling under their feet, they are already searching for other places to live because their former land is literally uninhabitable. But soon more of us will start to find ourselves in this boat. And so we're asking, where should we move? And the answer is, if you want a technical answer from a climate scientist who has had this conversation with her husband already over our own long-term planning, we have to look for places where the risks that they face today are ones that can continue to be manageable in the future, that have an ample supply of fresh water, an ample supply of other resources. And what looks really good is the Midwest and Ontario and that kind of area around the Great Lakes that has a lot of fresh water. It is prone to flooding, so you have to be careful where you live, because Minnesota has seen massive increases in flooding, as has my own home of Southern Ontario. But our resources are becoming particularly pressed in a lot of places like Miami with sea level rise, like Phoenix with extreme heat, like some areas of California with wildfire. People are starting to think, is it even worth this in the future? There's actually lists. The weather.com and other organizations have made lists of the top 25 cities that are likely most at risk from climate change, and the top 25 cities that are most likely safer from climate change impacts for the next few decades at least. So if you're interested, Google something about, cities and climate change, and you'll see some of these lists pop up.
David, we could go on a little bit farther, but I want to make sure we have some time here to answer some further questions. I would encourage people to maybe go and listen to some of her TED Talks and so on. I think it's very good. Any comments or questions? We have, I guess, what, about 15 minutes, 20 minutes left?
Sure. Now, some people don't have the raised hand apparently, but you do have some other little signals like a thumb up or a clapping hand or a face. Put anything up that you have, and Forrest will stop. If you have a funny face, put that up. Or
let me, maybe to start the discussion, I know we talked about this, David, a little bit earlier in the week when we were planning for this session. And I think I mentioned also 2 weeks ago that over the years, I've often been a consultant for ADRA on various projects that they're doing around the world, food security projects, agriculture, refugee resettlement, various kinds of things. And I think it would be useful for your class and for us as Adventists to rethink a little bit more. ADRA is one of the larger and better run social service charity organizations in the world. I think we can be proud of it and what it does. But what always amazed me, I would go on a consulting trip with ADRA. I remember the last one I went to Malawi. We were dealing with refugees who had fled flooding in Mozambique and came into Malawi. And and we would talk about the political, the economic, the social, the ethnic, all the issues related to it. It was and then I would go to church on Sabbath right there in Malawi, in Blantyre or in other cities, or I would come back here. And I kind of sensed a disconnect between what our average congregation understands. I'm talking about Adventist congregations, about the issues. Maybe once a year they put their offering in the support ADRA or to support your community services, and then we forget about and we, what's the word, the correct word here? We're kind of turning over to ADRA to do our good deeds. Whereas, as she suggests, many of us, maybe we don't really behave or practice our religion in ways the same way maybe we should. So how do we link our global responsibilities as a church, our macro responsibilities, to our individual ones? And how do we become more aware and more concerned? Now, another little, just to add to the discussion, I worked for many years among Muslims in Africa. And one of the things that I found particularly interesting about Islam, as I got to understand Islam, one of the 5 tenets of Islam is almsgiving, giving to the poor, to the refugee, to the needy. And the idea in Islam is that it has to be directly, the person giving to the person in need directly, face to face, and it's not, well, we send our fund once a year through gathering to this organization and they do the good deeds for us and we go on living our merry lives using our resources or whatever in ways that maybe we don't even think of. And it impressed me, this particular aspect of Islam. And I'm just wondering if maybe such, where do we find that in evangelical, in Adventism and other Christian, that idea of how we do charity? David, yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. You want me to talk about that? I see somebody had his or her hand up. The first issue is a difficult issue, and all I would hope is that those who are in our service organizations like ADRA and those who are in pastoral ministry would, from either side, move toward the center. It is often the complaint of the pastors that ADRA will be in the community and they won't even know that that the ADRA people are distant and sometimes even a little bit arrogant and look down upon the people who are in the local congregations, and typically not as well educated. People who are involved in these NGOs tend to be well educated and high-minded and so forth. So there is a built-in kind of challenge there, but I would hope that leadership would encourage the organizations and the pastoral staffs to move more closely together. But this is a matter that changes with General Conference leadership. And with the most recent General Conference leadership, ADRA has been put on the defensive because it is seen not to be so directly evangelistic. And so instead of leadership bring these two together, there's been a tendency to see the work of the church as quite different from and superior to the work of ADRA. And that has resulted in some personnel changes at ADRA and a lot of uncertainty and pain. So these are matters that really have to be addressed, and I think enlightened leadership will bring these different kinds of organizations together. We have a similar thing in this country. Often the healthcare systems have relatively little to do with the congregations in the areas. So like two Adventisms, the Adventisms of the medical centers and the Adventisms of the congregation. So that's a problem. Now,
could I speak? Let me defend ADRA just a little bit here. Not that I'm going to get them off the hook entirely, but they are supplied so much by government aid that they have to be very careful about walking across that line into a religious organization. So I understand that dilemma they're in. When I worked with the American Bible Society, we wanted to work something out with them, but we finally came to the point and said we couldn't do it because we were a religious organization, and ADRA is many ways funded by government. So they have to walk a line. So
well, that's helpful for us. That brings it into clearer relief. Yeah.
I can attest to that very same thing. And many of the projects that I did with ADRA 80 to 90% of their resources came through government grants, particularly the food aid program. You know, they depend very heavily on that. And it was interesting when I went to different countries, some countries decided that they wouldn't accept the government grants, and they would be a much smaller type of organization so that they could combine an evangelistic along with a service component. And that meant that they had very little money and very free food, no free food to give out and all those things. And that was a choice where I met other organizations. These are all ADRA organizations in various countries. And it was interesting how it depended a lot on the philosophy and the approach of the union, usually the union conference or the mission. And so I think one of the points you mentioned earlier, David, is important, is that we have a very diverse church. And if we really look at the global church and how they look at these issues, there's much more diversity than we're aware of. And we need to be understanding and helpful. I think your point about leadership, I find in many respects, the leadership at the union and in the local conference or mission level was more critical to helping ADRA do its work well than it was at the general conference level, although that does set the tone as well.
Interesting, very interesting. I think, Forrest, do you have anyone on deck?
You know, Bronwyn, you had your hand up a little while ago. Did you want to say something now, or?
And I think Ed Turner did as well.
Oh, Ed,
Yeah,
did you?
I just want to say that Forrest is absolutely correct. As we mentioned earlier, Restored Child's in 10 countries, and we run into ADRA all over the world. But they're, you know, you got to compare apples to apples, oranges to oranges.
Yeah.
ADRA cannot do certain things that Restore a Child, being a 501c3, can do.
Right, right.
You know, so, you know, saying one is good and one is bad, I think is a little bit unfair.
Right. Yeah. No. And this is why, you know, being educated and aware of the local context and the church context, and you know, there are many different ways of doing good. I think, you know, as citizens and as Adventist church members, maybe being more educated about these issues will help us to decide how we use our own offerings, where we send them. You know, I know this, we haven't talked much about the whole issue of stewardship, but stewardship is so critical and central to this idea of creation care. And stewardship also has to do with how, what organizations we support. How do we support it? Do we do it directly through the church organizations? Do we do it through our own offerings? Do we support others? How much do we do personally? Do we just hand it off our money and then expect others to do our good works? How do we behave in, you know, in our local community? How do we vote? There's so many different aspects to this. You know, it's not a simple answer. Yeah.
Bronwyn, you have?
Yes, please. Bob, I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about the climate refugees. Catherine Hayhoe mentioned Alaska and Louisiana, two places where Native Americans live.
Yes, this is really a growing phenomena. You know, I think, didn't we look at one of the videos here last Sabbath, was about the climate refugees coming out of Pacific Islands.
Right.
But, you know, we tend to think this is something happening a long ways away. But ones that I've looked at directly, you know, those coming from Central America, particularly the Northern Triangle, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, they're coming to our border. The estimate is that this whole stream of refugees, not all of them coming for climate reasons, maybe 10 to 15 to 20%, but it could grow up to 25 or 30% of refugees. Still, the largest number of refugees right now are coming because they want a better life, or maybe they're fleeing political revolution, or they're fleeing abusive, delinquency in the cities. There are many reasons why people become refugees, but the climate refugee issue is growing. Now in the US, right here where I live, here in southern Utah, one of the most heavily impacted regions is the Navajo reservation. There are real serious issues around water issues for the native organizations. So that's really growing in that. One that she didn't mention, but again, I observed some of this when I lived in Washington, D.C., around Chesapeake Bay. There are several small communities and islands on the outer banks and so on. So this whole issue of refugees is going to grow in time, definitely.
Let's remember, Bob, too, that climate refugees are not recognized as a legitimate refugee status.
Absolutely, and that's one of the big, actually the new administration just coming in, it's interesting how the current politics are changing. Just yesterday, there was a note that they're going to elevate the science advisor that used to be just an advisor to the president's office, elevate it to the to cabinet level status, and part of that is to deal with some of the science issues. They are, for the first time in history, USAID, the agency I used to work for, U.S. Agency for International Development, the new administrator is a former top diplomat, and for the first time it will be raised to national security status. And what they're saying is that issues of poverty and development, environment, all of these issues need to be put, as equal threats and issues to be dealt with besides just defense and monetary policy. So it's interesting how even in our politics right now, there's really a discussion trying to prepare to think about the threats that we will be facing in the future.
Okay, Rodney? Rodney Corker.
Yes. The most useful thing that I've heard this morning was when the speaker mentioned that the most polarized topic in the world, and increasingly so, is this issue of climate change. But the most important issue that she mentioned was we have to connect at the level of the heart, connect on value. If we don't have a conversation about common values, if we don't understand what stewardship means and what the values that underpin stewardship are, and have some agreement on that, same with the word dominion, same conversation about what ethics are under there, and we won't move forward. I feel that we're skating around the real richness and the essential parts of a conversation that we as Christians need to have. And maybe in the future, this speaker gets to that. But to me, as a Sabbath presentation, this is what I think the jewel of the discussion is. We assume that we have shared values. I like to assume that we have shared values, but the conversation and the fruit of those discussions show that we don't really have shared values. And in her 4-step process about how we engage and how we talk, she ends up with point 3, we need to have positive conversations. Well, how do we stage that positive conversation? What words do we use that interfere with a positive conversation? Because I suggest we're really not doing that well at all. So we can have a lot of conversations and use words like value and stewardship and some of these other words, ethics, but what are we really talking about at a root level? If we don't come together on these things, we're just having conversations that most of the world is having conversations about. And as she said, the problem continues to get bigger. How do we stop this problem getting bigger?
Absolutely, absolutely. David, what do you say? Unmute yourself. Yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to say 2 different things. One is that the specific topic of stewardship is a topic to which we ought to devote a Sabbath. It's a very rich topic in Christian circles. On the other hand, in ecological circles, it is a very controversial one. Not all ecologists like the idea of stewardship. And so we need to look at that idea along with the idea of dominion as we have it in Genesis 2 in a rather thorough way. So let's devote one Sabbath to that on the scriptural and meanings of it and the controversy about it. Now, the other thing that Rodney's mentioned is a whole question of values and shared values and what our values ought to be. That's more general. The issue of stewardship in particular is easy to isolate and identify. The other is more general, but I'm going to work with Rodney on this, and we're going to get him to make a presentation on those matters here in the not so distant future. I hope. Yeah.
And way to put him on the spot there.
Yeah, but he, I can deal with the specific issue of stewardship, but I think he is into some literature and so forth that I'm not. So we need to hear from him. Okay.
I've got David. I have Simona again, and then McKinley.
Okay.
Simona.
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. So when I listened to this, I remember a book called The Third Wave, written by Alvin Toffler in 1980s, where he talks about the future, and it was astonishingly predictive. He said that we will see the first wars for water resources in this decade.
Right.
And I think there are so many things that we take for granted. We live in a society that has easy access. We have easy access to water. We have easy access to food, to shelter, all these things. And we forget that the large parts of this world don't have that. And I think that we need to become a little bit more careful how we use the resources that we have, because they don't belong only to us. And I think that is one of the things that we probably touched a little bit last week, is that the world is not belongs to all people who live on it, not just us who live in a relatively rich society, but to all people, and that we need to become more involved in an equitable share of these resources.
Thank you, Simona. Those are important words. Yeah, absolutely. And McKinley, I guess he had some.
McKinley, you're up. You're at bat.
Thank you very much. Very good discussion. I just want to give a couple of quick comments. So for Dave and Dr. Ford, if you class members took action last week to do their part on reducing climate emissions, I've got a few comments in the chat that suggested people try to drive 65 miles an hour, but found it difficult to do. But at least they took action on some of what the class talked about last week. The other thing I want to share is every Californian now is doing their part to reduce climate emissions. The gasoline and diesel fuel that you buy or that move your goods to the supermarket include a fee related to climate emissions as a consequence of the carbon intensity standards that California has set. So every time you buy a gallon of gasoline or go to the grocery store to buy your food, that truck that moved the food to the store is paying a fee. For Dr. Ford, I'd like a comment on this from you. Many stakeholders talk about reducing climate emissions as almost not too difficult, and yet it's very hard. And I wonder if in the sort of easy way that the solutions are talked about gives a false sense that this thing can be imminently solved. I'll stop there and then I'll talk a little bit about some of the California challenges.
No, I think you make a good point, and that's something that Dr. Hayhoe was basically saying as well, is that, you know, somehow we get the feeling that if we, you know, we just, I mean, we buy an electric car and we, you know, we all the different things we can do that make us feel good, that contribute, we become vegetarian, all of that's important. But if you start looking at the real causes of climate change, it really comes down to very basic systemic issues in our economy, in transportation systems, in the way wealth is generated, and so on. And of course, there are those that suggest, some of them are Christian and others are not, that it's the excesses of our capitalist system that really sets us up for some of these problems. And so now trying to find the solutions, I think she did comment, instead of debating over whether climate change is happening and how fast and the facts, if we would debate more carefully about the solutions, there are different kinds of solutions. We could, you know, that's really where the debate needs to move, and it's not going to be easy. You know, there are those that are, you know, on the alarmist side that says, you know, some kind of very radical reformulation of the capitalist system is what's needed, where there are others that are saying all we need to do is make capitalism more accountable, more citizen friendly, more environmental friendly. So there's a lot of room for debate, and I think focusing on those solutions. But you're absolutely right, it's not going to be easy. Whatever improvements we get, as she said, it means we're less problems in the future. But the future is really uncertain. It really depends on how we act, how we vote, how we change our economic behaviors, how we work together with other nations. There's a lot of things that are up in the air.
So the class will forgive me for just focusing on this a little bit more. But here is the information for California. The Global Warming Solutions Act sets a goal to reduce the carbon emissions by 90% below 1990 levels. That's California's target. That's what we're working towards. The California emissions inventory is about 420 million metric tons. The transportation sector makes up about 40% of that fraction. California so far has allocated something like close to $30 billion to help solve this problem, and the needle isn't moving. Something as easy as driving at a moderate speed is what every Californian can do and every Adventist Christian can do to start to solve the problem. But if something as simple and as direct as driving at moderate speed is a challenge, how realistic do you think is the prospect of getting to the climate goals as defined by Paris 2.0?
Can I say something about that? And this is probably more of a theological or ethical question. And David, maybe you'll raise this when you get to talk about stewardship and dominion and so on. I think part of whether we believe this is solvable, or at least we can reduce it to a level where we reduce the number of people impacted, depends a lot on your belief and your confidence in human nature. Do we believe that we as humans, as a human race, are inherently evil, and that you know, we will destroy ourselves and the world and there's nothing we can do about it? Or do we believe that we have responsibilities, we have agency, we have the capacity to actually do something about it? And it's not just individually in our own behaviors or purchasing or voting, but how do we act as a society? And it seems to me that this is as more fundamental is getting back to what Dr. Hayhoe is saying. It's a heart issue more than it is than a head issue. Is how do we feel about other people? How do we feel about collaboration, agency? Can we? Now, David, I'm going to throw this back to you again, because I think this really gets more into the arena of ethics and behavior and psychological makeup and the nature of man, the nature and so on. And of course, that's been a question going back to 1,000 years. So where do we go, David?
David, before you answer that question, may I just add to this? Because I think Dr. Ford is really getting to the heart of the issue. We like to focus on what the government's actions are. But yet, in things like driving, it is the cumulative effect of our driving practices that make the transportation emissions very difficult to solve.
Right.
So yeah, go ahead.
Another thing that might be helpful, in most of my research over the years, I focused on an issue that is called global change. And in the global change community, we tend to distinguish between two kinds of change. One of them is what we call systemic change. And just to kind of illustrate it, you've all heard the story that, a butterfly flaps its wings in China and we get a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. Well, what are they trying to say? Is to say that there are some changes in systems that you tweak something, you make a change, and this or that or the other, and the whole system readjusts. And particularly if you get to tipping points and then things kind of collapse and so on. So that whole idea of systemic change is very important. But you can also, a lot of change is what we call cumulative change. And these are changes that come about in all kinds of systems, whether it be in banking behavior, whether it be in social behavior, whether it be in climate or in whatever. It's small cumulative actions over time that gradually get to the point that it produces a tipping point and a catastrophic change. And that, of course, an example of the latter is the increased use of our resources, land use change, agriculture change. You eventually get to the point where there's a drastic change. So, understanding those differences and understanding how our human actions affect those different kinds of change, I think is important. That's just from a scientific perspective, but maybe it applies in the theological perspective as well. How many Christians would it take to get their individual actions together cumulatively so it actually makes a change in how we behave as a church or as a country or whatever? There's both a systemic change and there's a cumulative change. And we're responsible for both. I don't know if that helps, but.
Okay, David, I have one more person. It's Roger. He has a question.
And then also there's a question here from Bernie Just, and I'll read it when the time has come, okay? And then after that, we're probably going to have to call it a day for now.
All right, Roger.
Oh, thank you. Fascinating discussions in an area that I've been interested in for a number of years. I'm going to hit my. Come on. I wanted to be able to. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can hear you.
Oh, okay. Anyway, look, I have a question for Robert in regard to the cutting of emissions and the aspect of the aerosol masking effect that more people are talking about this. I think BBC had production on that some time back, that if you cut emissions by 30 to 40%, the aerosols that coal and gas and oil kicks up into the atmosphere, which is a reflective element, reflects the rays of the sun back. If we were to cut emissions by 30 to 40%, it would reduce that aerosol masking effect, and the planet would heat, I forget how many degrees, I think it was maybe 3/100 or 3/10 or some, maybe a half of a degree Celsius in matter of weeks, because those aerosols fall out of the air there, and consequently, it would have a dramatic effect on the planet and its warming, and consequently, the growing of crops, primarily grains. And we talked a little bit about that, Robert, sometime back, where you mentioned something about rice and climate change on the effect of producing of rice. And so I'm wondering if we're in a catch-22, where really, if you attempt to go one way, you're going to exacerbate the problem. And if you don't do anything, the problem will just continue to get worse. And so is it possible that civilization has come to the point, as some are saying, I think Paul Ehrlich, the guy from Stanford, and Peter Wadham, who's an Arctic expert in sea ice. What they see happening in the Arctic now, they don't see that turning around. It's going to get exceedingly worse because of blue ocean event and more melting of ice and the clathrates and methane coming out, and the permafrost, which is a very heat trapping molecules, and more moisture in the atmosphere now, because as the climate warms, there's more evaporation. So consequently, that's a big heat trapping molecule, water itself, vapor. Could we be to the point where the second coming of Christ might be the solution to this whole thing, and that we ought to look at that a little more realistically as Seventh-day Adventists in our name? That's our hope. Just my question.
You raised a lot of very important questions, and I don't know if I can answer all of the technical questions, but I think the underlying point that you're raising is one. I remember Dr. Hayhoe in her presentation talked about the 5 different ways that people are looking at things. On one extreme, there's the alarmists, to say we're, like you say, we're going to hell in a handbasket. We've already passed the tipping point. There's nothing we can do. We're all dead, and just get used to it. Get over it. Okay. All the way over to the other end, well, there's really nothing's happening here. Everything's fine. Be merry, move on, buy your goods, whatever. And then there's she talked about 3 different levels in between. Those that are open-minded and interested and want to find. But it's true that a lot of terrible things are happening. If you look at, you mentioned what's happening with the release of methane in the atmosphere from the in the tundra, what's happening with the sea ice, and so on. I think one thing we need to remember is life will still be here. And maybe the key question you're raising is, will human civilization survive? But will we destroy human civilization by our lack of good stewardship, and there's nothing we can do? And then the world will, evolution, plants, bugs, other things will still be here. We know in the geological record, there have been at least 6 mass extinctions. Maybe we're going to be part of the next extinction. Maybe that's what we're facing. But the question is, okay, even if that's happening, do we accelerate it by misbehavior, or do we do something to try to improve and to deal and I guess go back to the parable of the 10 virgins? What do we do while we're waiting? Okay.
Well, may I just interrupt for a moment, if I may?
Sure.
You talk about, Guy McPherson. I've sent you some information on him, and I know you're aware of what his position is. He's very conservative, as a doomsdayist. Yeah, he feels that we have passed the tipping points, basically.
Right.
And really, it's now more of mitigation, it's more adaptation, and that we have to be realists and realize that things are going to get better and there's no turning it around. But one of the things he talks about is that as the economy gets worse and worse, and people are, the economy is such that you could see people not even attending the nuclear power plants, that we could begin to see nuclear power plants melting down. And there's what, 450 as such. That radiation, his point of view, and I don't know if scientifically true, is that it would affect the atmosphere. What is it? The ozone layer.
Right.
That would cause the temperature to heat up even that much more quickly, that it would destroy basically all life on Earth. It'd be like some of our sister planets that maybe at one time had life, no longer do. I'm just saying, it seems to me there is so much science today that says it's locked in, it's game over. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't do anything. I think we ought to do everything we can to make this world a better place to live. We ought to do what we can to help our neighbors and to help the poor and to be kind and gentle and to do everything we can to be winsome, to make this world a better place to live. But is there a point where we say, when you look at the reality, now I know you're saying that probably depends on people and their views, what is reality? But it seems to me this is one reality that looks like, as Noam Chomsky says, that climate change and nuclear war are the two biggest existential threats to civilization. And yet, are we even addressing that possibility that we have we've come to the end? Now, how should we therefore live? How should we prepare ourselves and others to a future that isn't there? Therefore, the Christian message has a hope. Whereas looking at this purely from a scientific point of view, it seems to me and many others that there really isn't hope. But Jesus and the second coming is a real hope. And it could be, as we look at how things are unwinding, we can say his coming, yes, is near, which we've been saying since 1844, the soon coming of Christ. But have we seen the evidence, the scientific evidence, rather than earthquakes and floods, et cetera, et cetera? When you look at the science, we are looking at extinction.
No, I think you're right. Those two existential threats, climate change and nuclear holocaust, are definitely, very dangerous, and it would mean probably the extinction rapidly of humans, but not just humans. A lot of life. It would definitely change things quite dramatically.
Yeah.
And then but again, I guess the question really does come back to a spiritual one, a stewardship question, an ethical question. I still think that some of the alarmists are too extreme, and I think that there is a possibility for adaptation and resilience. One of the things that will happen is that there will be smaller and smaller spaces on the earth where people can survive, and that's why there will be more and more refugees. They will be fleeing places where they can't survive long, but there will be places where human society probably will make it. And this is kind of like the analogy of the Tower of Babel and the early stories. There will, the Noah's Ark. There will be places where plant life and human life maybe survives. We don't know. This is somewhat speculation. But to me, I would rather be hopeful and say we can do some things. We can while we wait. And I think whether it's spiritual hope or whether it's scientific hope or it's societal hope, trying to look for that, to me, I think it's more helpful than just simply saying, okay, it's all going to hell in the handbasket. Let me just save myself and forget all of the rest of the people. And it's and we all know the stories of what happened on the Titanic, on a sinking ship. How do people behave in a crisis? The worst comes out, the people that are jumping into the lifeboat and throwing out the others, the weak and the infirmed, and then the guys with the money get into the lifeboat and get away. Is that what, you know, and of course, there was a whole book written about that, what they called lifeboat ethics. How does one, and that wasn't just about getting off a sinking ship, but it's how do you get off of a sinking planet? So it's back to the verse that Bronwyn rose at the beginning. David talked about the earth is groaning and it's terrible. So how do we behave in this kind of existential threat? Let me stop talking, and I'm sure we'll continue with this. But David, how do we deal with this? And we'll continue this discussion later, I'm sure.
Okay, 1 second here. I think we're going to have to conclude. It's almost 1 o'clock, and we had better stop. We have one question here from Bernie Justice. Says, I'm curious, what do SDAs from other parts of the world believe and do in regard to climate change? It seems in USA, SDAs follow a particular political party, namely the Republicans, more than what their belief in caring for God's creation. Maybe really quickly, I can respond to that in 2 ways. One, I don't know what's happening around the world. Bob might, but let's pick that up next time. Secondly, on the Republican tendencies of Adventism, I think that's true of people who live in places like I live, but I think that in other places, suppose we go to African American congregations or other congregations where the church is growing much more swiftly than in the European churches of European descent, I think one will find less identification with the Republican Party in those ranges. This kind of a connection with the Republican Party is for people who live in places like Loma Linda and Tacoma Park and places like that. So I think it's not quite as politically unanimous as we see. Now back to Roger, and Bob. Bob's mind went right to mine, that is the Titanic. And let's suppose that the ecological world is in fact sinking and there's nothing we can do about it. It's all going to go down. Well, minimally, we should help each other die comfortably.
Yes.
Minimally. And we can die more comfortably or less comfortably, but let's kind of go on to palliative care as a civilization and try to be of comfort to people as we all die. On the other hand, it may be that the ship is not totally hopeless. And I'm among those who think that. That is, I think we can repair the Titanic and get it back floating enough so that life will continue. There will be major changes. I've thought about all these big hotels in all major cities that are not likely to be filled up as people travel less and less to conventions and so forth. They could be turned into living cities. 32-story building could have all kinds of houses, condominiums, recreational facilities in them, shopping. Each one of those could become a urban center. So there are a lot of things that could happen. When we talk about changing topics again, if we think about this, we can think about smoking. On the one hand, we've had a very personal approach to this, helping people with 5-day plans and so forth to stop smoking themselves. On the other hand, in the case of people like Roy Branson, we've been working on public policy at the national level, and that has brought about lots of change, particularly taxation change has really made a difference in the number of people who smoke in this country. So I don't think the ship is totally sinking, but even if it is, let's make life as comfortable as we can on the way down. But I am really reminded of people who said slavery will never be over with. We'll never get rid of slavery, but we did. Or smoking will never become unfashionable, but it did. And I think that driving over 65 miles an hour can become unfashionable too. And eating meat can become unfashionable. And these 90 corporations that are putting out 2/3 of the world's emissions, pollutions, I should say, we need to take a look at that. We've broken up big corporations in the past. We might have to do some work on that front too, but it's very, very difficult because people don't want to give up the way of life that we have. But really, is my life so much worse because now I drive a 4-cylinder Subaru, which is really comfortable inside, as opposed to that 8-cylinder 1970 Cadillac Coupe de Ville, which was so big I could lie sideways in it? I don't think so. I'm not enjoying my life any less because I drive this smaller and in many ways much more comfortable car than I had back then. So I think we can make progress. I'm not ready to give up, but if we are ready to give up, we need to take care of each other as best we can. Well, we'll continue. I need to think in terms with Bob and Rodney and Roger and McKinley about how we can continue this. Maybe not exactly next week. Maybe we'll turn to some other thing for a little while and then come back to this. But I'm hoping that the Roy Branson Sabbath School will become an eco-sab, and we'll keep coming back to this from time to time. Okay, here's the benediction for our eco-sab, all right? The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, everybody. Have a happy Sabbath. Have a rest.
Thank you, Bob, for your presentations. Good conversation, Dave.
Thank you all.
Yeah. For those that are still on, I can just say that other parts of the world do look at this differently. I found in Mozambique, in Peru, in Rwanda, in Switzerland, and so on. So the Adventist world does have a much broader and distinct views on these issues. So maybe sometime in the future we can talk about some of that.
Hey, David.
Thank you.
Larson, David Larson.
Yes.
Your remarks, your closing remarks were profound. Thank you. And thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Thank you.
And Roger.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very good. Happy Sabbath, everybody. I'm checking out. I've got a family waiting for me to eat lunch because I'm an hour behind you guys.
Okay.
Oh, Bob.
Happy Sabbath.
Hello.
We will do that. Okay. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, Bob. We'll be in touch.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye, McKinley.
Bye, Bronwyn. Hope you had a great week.
Yeah, it was. It
That's
ended
good.
as it started.
That's good. So we'll chat tomorrow.
Yeah, sounds good.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.